Daniel Womack. I'm an alcoholic. Thank you, Stephen. I'll warn everybody up front. I got a bit of a cold. One of the worst kinds, too. I hate the cold that comes with a cough. So I'm gonna. I got a cough drop in my mouth now, and got my herbal tea here. So hopefully I can get through this talk without coughing too much. My sobriety date's August 1st, 97. We got a home group. It's called the Primary Purpose Group. We meet in Southern Pines, North Carolina, which is not too far from Whispering Pines. In fact, I could just about throw a rock and hit Southern Pines from my house. We meet at the First Baptist Church on Mondays and Thursday nights at 7 o'clock. And I've been a member of that group since August of 97. Actually, that group started in June of 97. And they tell me I'm the first newcomer at that group. So, and I'm still there. So I think I'm going to keep coming to that group. I've got a sponsor. My sponsor's got a sponsor. I'm pretty sure he's got a sponsor too. My sponsor lives in Raleigh. I talk to him every Tuesday at 3 o'clock. And except today, which he called me about 3:15. So he was late. But I always call him. But he texted me this morning. He said I'm running behind, and I'll call you sometime after 3. So he called me. I think it was about 3:30 actually when I think about it. And got on the phone, and I answered the phone, and he says to me, he said, "All right, go." And I said, "Well, I got a few things here." And he said, "Well, you're gonna have to go fast because I got to be off of here by 4. And about 90% of the time on our conversations, he does about 75% of the talking. So I told him, I said, "Well, I'll get through this pretty quick." But I really appreciate my sponsor. He's helped me a lot. I've been through some pretty tough times over the last couple of years, including separation and divorce, pretty rough stuff. And he's been right there with me step in step, and really has pulled me through a lot of emotional tough stuff. So I'm here to tell you in a general way what I was like, what happened, and what I'm like today. And I like to start out with talking about it helps me remember. It really helps me to remember kind of where I came from. But my earliest memory was I can remember cold floors on bare feet. I can remember that. And I'm pretty sure that's when I was 3 or 4 years old, and I lived in an old farmhouse with wooden floors. And that's about all I remember about that. But my next earliest memory is I remembered my first day in kindergarten. I don't know if anybody's ever remembered their first day in kindergarten, but I hope it was a happy memory. My first memory wasn't. It was full of fear, and it was full of just uncertainty. I'd never been really apart from my family, and I got sent to kindergarten, and it felt almost like the first time I went to jail. I mean, it was a traumatic experience, really. But I remember when it was time to go home, I needed to get on the bus to make it home. And here I am, 5 years old. And I just don't know which bus to get on. I mean, and I remember they had wrote on my hand the bus number. So I was looked down at the number on my hand. And I was trying to figure out which bus I was supposed to get on. But the only problem was I couldn't read. I couldn't read letters or numbers. And and so I'm trying to figure out what bus to get on. And it seemed like there's 100 buses in the parking lot. And there probably wasn't more than 5 or 6. But as I'm walking along trying to find my bus, this lady reaches out and says, "Let me see your hand." So she gets my hand and she sticks me on the bus. She says, "This is your bus." And I'm trying to cross check her, and I can't read. And plus the handwriting probably wasn't that good either. And and I just had to trust her to get on the bus. And I was scared to death I was never going to see my parents again. And well, apparently I made it home because I'm here tonight. But that's my earliest memory. And I'm here to tell you, if I had a drink that day, I would not have been worried about that bus. I can promise you that, because alcohol changed that for me the very first time I drank. And if I'd have known what alcohol would have done for me, I'd have been drinking in kindergarten. I can promise you that. And because I was a guy that had a lot of fear and anxiety all up through school. I had a hard time making friends. I just didn't fit in where I was at. I just always kind of felt like I was on the outside looking in. I was never really a part of. I was always apart from. I would compare. I would look at everybody's, what was going on around them and what their lives looked like to me, and I would compare that to my life, and I just didn't feel like I measured up. I always felt like I had a short straw. And then when I was in my own house, I felt like my sister always got preferred treatment. She was the baby. I always thought she had more than me. And that was true to some extent, but not the way I thought about it. So get on up through middle school, and I get into high school, and remember being in the 9th grade, and things changed a lot because I was come from a small middle school. Then I went to high school, and I don't remember how many was in that school, but there was a lot more students than what I was used to. And I'm in the 9th grade, and I remember, I don't know, I was always pretty good in school. I mean, I was always more or less above average, but I was the kind of student that didn't study. And I would just come in and take the test and and do well on the test. I wouldn't do my homework. And then they would go around the class and be checking to see if you'd done your homework. Well, I'd be doing my homework while they was going around the classroom. And I'd make sure I'd sit in some chair somewhere where I'd be like on the end of the checklist. And my last name was Womack, so I was always on the end of the roll call and everything. So that had its benefits. But so that's kind of how I got through school. And so I was kind of more or less a and B student through most of my school. My father was he was a bit of a perfectionist. He probably would admit to that. But he was a bit of a perfectionist. So when I came home with a report card, even if it had all A's and B's, he would point out the B's as being a problem area, and I need to pull those up. And he'd ask me what the problem was or whatever. Heaven forbid if I made a C. That was unacceptable. And conduct had to be, a perfect grade. And so I'm grateful for the way I was raised, because it taught me, kind of the importance of trying to do your best, that kind of thing. He taught strong work ethics and morals. He was a very honest man, still is to this day, well respected in the community. I have nothing but respect for my father. There was a time that was not the case, but thankful to this program and actually getting some maturity, I respect him more than I ever have. And even as a child, I always looked up to my father. Anyway, so here I am in high school, I'm still having trouble fitting in because I don't quite fit in with any group in school. I mean, I just can't quite find, where I should fit. There's always little different groups in high school that kind of run together, and I just don't quite fit with any of those. And then one day I was at a dinner. My family attended this church, and it was quite common to meet together with other families and have meals together, and it was acceptable for them to enjoy cocktails. And so that was something they did on a regular basis. And that was what they were doing this one day. And I remember I was sitting on the couch there in the living room area. And there were several other kids there my age, some younger, some older, guys and gals. And I was doing what I typically do. I was just sitting there watching the others seem like they were having a good time, wanting to be a part of, but really afraid to, not really participating, just observing was kind of my MO. And I was doing that at this time. And then one of the older kids, he was about a year older than me, he came over to me and he said, "Here, I want to show you something." And so we walked into the kitchen area. And in the kitchen area, there was off to the side, there was a utility room where there was a washer and dryer. And we walked in that utility room, and on that washer and dryer, there was this huge assortment of liquor bottles. And just all different kinds. And he looked at me and he said, "You want to make a drink?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And up until this point, I drank maybe a half a beer with my father and uncle one time. Never had a buzz off in beer. I had tasted it here and there, that kind of thing. And when we walked into that kitchen and I saw those liquor bottles and we decided to make a drink, I just naturally, intuitively knew what to do. And I walked over to the cabinet, opened the cabinet looking for a glass. And I remember looking, and I was going like this, looking, and poof, there was a souvenir cup. It had a picture of a moose on the front of it. It's a plastic cup. I pulled that out. And the important thing about that cup was it held 32 ounces. Then I walked over there to the washer and dryer area. And so I'm sitting there with that moose cup, and I don't really know what to do. But I remember seeing my father make a drink here and there. So I just grabbed some of the liquors and I just started putting it in that cup. And I don't know, I was mixing the browns and the whites. I'm not even sure what I was doing. And so I put all that liquor in there and then went back and found me some cola to put in there with it. Went back, sat down on that couch again, went back to doing what I was doing, except I was drinking now. And I began to start sipping on that alcohol. And it wasn't long. And I experienced pretty much exactly what the big book talks about in the doctor's opinion, when he mentions that the alcoholic is looking for that sense of ease and comfort that comes from a few drinks. Well, this sense of ease and comfort just started coming over me. I don't know how else to describe it better than this, but if you've ever been on a lake where there's a lot of boats on a lake, it gets real choppy, wavy, and the boats are bouncing all around. But if you go out on that same lake in the middle of the night and there's no wind and no boats, it's smooth as glass. Well, that's what alcohol did for me, is it smoothed the waters on the inside. They were all churning up and I was ill at ease and I was uncomfortable, and all of a sudden it just smoothed all that out. And I remember looking at these other kids and they were like they were having a good time. And at first I was thinking how I really I didn't measure up to them. I couldn't be a part of what they were doing. I didn't feel like I could be. But after I began to drink, all of a sudden I felt like I was part of them. I was an equal, I could be a part of. And it wasn't long before I started realizing You know, I'm a little bit smarter than they are. I'm a little bit better than they are. I keep on drinking. Next thing I know, it's so much like, what do I need them for? That's how much liquor changed me. Is it took a guy that couldn't even participate in society and made me to the point where it didn't even matter anymore. And it's just amazing transformation. And that's why I drank. Every time I drank, it changed the way I felt about, you know, about myself and about everybody around me. It helped me to just live a life where I wasn't full of fear. And so what ended up happening was nothing miraculous that night. I had a great time. I didn't get sick or anything like that. I remember it was time to go home, and I had my permit at the time, and my father always let me drive. So I would drive him around with that permit. But that night, he told me to get in the back seat, that he was going to drive. And that was unusual. So I'm convinced to this day he knew I'd been drinking, but he never mentioned anything at all about it. And so I remember nothing came of it. I just went home, and all I could think about was the good time I had that night, and I couldn't wait to do it again. And so I did. I had another time to drink. I remember going into Sanford, North Carolina, which isn't that far from here, about halfway from here to Raleigh. And and we were at a house, and me and another guy, and we found somebody that could go buy some beer. And I remember trying to get him to buy us a 12-pack. And he said, "Oh no, that's too much." He said, "I'm gonna buy you guys a 6-pack. That's plenty." And I'm glad he made that decision, because that was plenty. But we got back to the other guy's house, and I remember sitting in the driveway, and I've got my beer, he's got his, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm going to get my 3. I know that. And so I'm drinking away. And next thing I know, I'm on that third one. And so I drank like 2.5 beers in like 10 minutes or something. And I look at him, and he's still on that first one. And all of a sudden, too much beer too fast. I had to open that door and let some of it out. And I remember turning around and looking back at him, and he had this aghast look on his face. He was like just appalled. And I'm like, "Dude, what's the matter with you?" And he's like, "Man, I can't drink anymore after that." And I said, "Good." So I drank his too. Again, I had a wonderful time that night. Good, nice buzz on like 5 beers. I was 16 years old, weighed about 130 pounds. It was another one of those spiritual experiences, if you will. And still no trouble. And then I went on another trip, and this one was a little bit more eventful. Ended up started out went to a guy's house, and he had about 2/3 of a fifth of Bacardi 151. I was 16 years old, and nobody wanted to drink it except for another guy friend of mine. And he didn't have anything to drink in that house except water and Bacardi. So me and the other guy split what was left of that fifth and drank water behind it. Then we went to some liquor house, because I lived in a dry county, and some guy was buying us shots of liquor. Then we almost got in a fight, got ran off, went into town and bought a couple of 40s of OD and began drinking those. Somewhere at this point, I go into a blackout, don't remember anything. Came to in my house. Somehow I drove there, don't remember anything about it. I remember getting up and him wanting to go home. And so I went to try to drive him home. I lived on a pretty long driveway. And so I drove down the driveway. He says I almost ran into the pond, but I don't believe it. But I don't remember anything about it. I was in a blackout. Then I ran directly into the ditch because I didn't turn right or left when I got to the mailbox. It totaled my car. So I pretty much totaled my car in my driveway. put us both in the hospital. And I was 16 years old. And I remember going to the hospital. And I remember the state trooper asking us if we drove, who was driving the car. And neither one of us really knew. And because we were both in blackouts. And so none of us could tell who drove. And so I ended up getting out of that TWI and getting a careless and reckless. But I got a seatbelt violation too. I'm like, what the heck? I guess he asked me if I had my seatbelt on. I must have said no like an idiot. But anyway, so that was my first DWI. Second one I got, I was 18. And I got that one. It seemed like a good idea to try to go to the beach at 2 o'clock in the morning and stop in a little sleepy town and go to the bathroom in McDonald's or whatever, Hardee's or McDonald's or whatever it was in that town. And I was thinking to myself, what are all these police doing in here? I walked in there and there was like 7 or 8 of them in there sitting around. I'm like, what are they doing in here? I went to the bathroom, got back in the car and drove 2 blocks, and I realized what they were doing there. They was waiting for me because I got pulled over, and ended up spending the night in that jail there. And 2 guys I was with waited for me all night because neither one of them had driver's license. What they didn't know was they took mine too when they took me to jail. And so we had to call one of them's wife to come and get us. She had to drive like 2 hours to come and get us, and she had 2 small kids, and so the kind of damage you do. But I remember calling my dad from the jail, and the guy I was with, his name was Leroy, and I remember calling my dad from the jail saying, Dad, I'm stuck down here in Elizabethtown and in jail. I need you to come and get me. And he told me, he said, Leroy got you in there, Leroy can get you out. And hung up on me. It was funny. Well, I'm the one that got me in there, but he looked at Leroy as being a grown man. Leroy's like 28 years old. But I always thought that was funny. But I'm glad he left me in there. I wasn't then, but I am now. But I had another DWI, but just to move along, I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of where alcohol took me. I became a daily drinker at about, I don't know, 19 or 20 years old. And I was drinking after work every day. And then on weekends, I would drink pretty much the time I got up and whatever time I went to bed. I was steady drinking. And I would try to stay out of trouble. And it seemed like most of the time when I got in trouble was because I would just start. I don't know if anybody's ever had this happen, but I'd start out the night with the thought process of what I was going to do. I'm going to go here, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to come home at a decent hour, I'm going to get some sleep. And I would start out the night like that. But I would get to drinking somewhere, and sometimes that would happen. But quite often, once I would begin to drink, I would start making poor decisions. It was really like the things that I had planned were no longer important. And I would start making these decisions that would put me in precarious positions. And it was almost like once I began to drink, it was kind of like, I like the old Chinese proverb. I think it's a Chinese proverb. It talks about the man takes a drink, the drink takes a drink, and then the drink takes the man. And that's kind of what would happen to me. Not every time, but any times I got into trouble, that's pretty much what happened. And I knew that if I drank hard liquor, that it would greatly increase the chances of me going into a blackout and going somewhere where I hadn't planned or doing some things I didn't intend on. So I would try not to drink liquor. So I'd go somewhere and just drink beer. But the problem was, once I would begin drinking beer, it would suddenly become a good idea to drink a couple of shots too. And that's what would happen. And then once that would happen, quite often it would be a good idea to do something else I never intended on doing that night. Whether it was go to the dope man's house or go over here into the bathroom and smoke something or whatever, that was never on my mind until I got into other harder stuff. And and it was just like it, so it would lead to other things. But so let me just tell you what a typical work day would look like for me. I would wake up in the morning and I would be I'd be so hungover from the night before that I couldn't even brush my teeth. My mouth, I'd be so sick and queasy, and I was just I'd feel like I was vibrating on the inside. My whole insides would feel like they were vibrating. I was about to come apart. And the thought of just drinking water or ingesting anything would just turn my stomach. And I would think to myself about drinking, and I would just, I cannot do this again today. And I would just swear it off. I am not doing this again today. I cannot drink today. There's no way I can do this again. And I would somehow go to work in that condition. And I worked in construction. And it might be summertime, it might be wintertime. Both were bad, but summer would be really tough. But I'd go to work like that, and after a couple of hours, I would start feeling a little better. It was just something would change, and I would start feeling a little better. And what seemed like the most horrible idea, suddenly my mind would change. It's almost like it would turn on me. And I would start thinking, you're feeling a little bit better. You've been able to drink a little water now, and you've been able to eat a little bit of something. Maybe you're overreacting. Maybe it isn't that big a deal. Maybe you can figure out how to make it work better tonight. I think I'm just going to think on this a little bit. So I go on back to work, and my mind would start. And what that is that obsession would come over me. The craving not really happening because I hadn't taken a drink, but that obsession in my mind turned to that drink. And I'm starting to rationalize how a drink can probably make things okay again. And I would start thinking, these are my typical thoughts, is I'd start thinking, man, I think you drank on an empty stomach last night. You didn't eat enough food. You need to eat more dinner tonight. Yeah, eat more dinner, and that way you won't be drinking on an empty stomach. And I would think about it and be like, I don't think I drank a glass of water before I went to bed. That's probably why I was so dry the next day and so dehydrated. I need to drink some water right before I go to bed. And my head was hurting too. That's probably because you were dehydrated. And another thing is you need to take a couple of aspirin before you go to bed. Take a couple of aspirin. That'll help if that headache won't be so bad in the morning. But yeah, eat more food, drink some water before I go to bed, and take a couple of aspirin and get this thing figured out. Be much better the next day. And so I'd go on to work, and I'd be working, get through lunch. By the afternoon, I'm so thirsty for a drink, I can hardly stand it. Then I get off from work, I start heading home. That's where the alcohol is. I'm already starting to feel better because I know I'm going to get that drink in a few minutes. And I get there and I grab it, take a big swig, and already feeling even better. Hadn't even hit my gut yet. I know it's coming. I take it right into the shower with me, drink in the shower. Some good social drinking in the shower. And then that starts my night of drinking. And if dinner isn't ready soon, I'm probably not going to eat any. And then that sets off that craving, of course. And I never knew how much I was going to drink. I might just drink 4 or 5 beers and go pass out. I'm so tired. Then again, I might drink 24 beers. Then again, I might drink 3 or 4 beers and leave and go to the club or something in the middle of the work week. I never quite knew what would happen. And so the times that I would pretty much be a good boy and go to bed or whatever, I would look at those times and think I was controlling it, that I've got this thing figured out. And I just kind of lived my life like that. And I just kept doing that, repeating that same behavior over and over again. And so that was kind of my life for, I don't know how long I'd done that, but that was a daily thing. And then I remember one time my girlfriend at the time, she went out of town to visit family down in Jacksonville, Florida. I took Amtrak down there. We had one car, and I remember realizing that she couldn't drive me anywhere, so I had to be a good boy and not get in too much trouble. And I remember I wanted to go to the local bar down the road, and so I go to this bar, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm just going to go in there and have 2 beers. That's it. Just 2 beers. And I was thinking to myself, looking back on it now, I don't ever remember a time when I made a conscious decision, I'm just going to go in here and have 2 beers. I don't remember ever doing that except that one time. But I went into that bar to have 2 beers, and I had 2 beers and a whole lot more. I don't remember how many more, but I remember I got in there at 5:30 that afternoon, sometime about there, and I left the bar at 2:30 in the morning. And it wasn't by choice, it's because they were closing the bar. And I had been drinking that whole time. And I'm here to tell you, it don't take that long to drink 2 beers. So when I left, I was pretty much wasted. And I remember getting in the car, but before I did, I was drinking with a guy, and he was kind of a hard drinker. I would call him a hard drinker. The big book talks about the hard drinker. He was a drinker that would drink you under the table in an hour, but then he wouldn't drink anything for a couple of hours. He would just, he would drink hard like that and then wouldn't drink anything. So when it was time to go home, he's pretty much sober. And so he said, I could give you a ride home if you want me to. I said, no, I got this. So I get in the car and I drive about 2 miles and get pulled over by a state trooper. Nicest state trooper that ever pulled me over. Thought he was going to let me go. I asked him, I said, you going to let me go? He said, no, you're going to jail. And so we did. And we got to the jail, and I remember they let me sign my own bond. So I written promise. So they didn't even lock me up. And they gave me a phone call. And so I called that same guy that was going to take me home, and he came to the jail and picked me up. And took me home. And so I got that DWI. And the good thing about that DWI was it sent me through another treatment program, outpatient treatment. I had to go and get an assessment where they ask you all these questions about your drinking. And I remember I was going to try to ace this test. I had taken it before, and it didn't turn out good the first time I took it. And so, getting an Amber Alert here. And so I took that test and was going to try to beat the system. So I remember looking at these questions, and the questions would be something like, how often do you drink? Be like, A, every day. Well, I know I'm not going to say that. Then it would be like, D, never. I said, well, I can't say never because I'm in here for a DWI. And it would be like, it was an option for like every 6 months. So I picked that. And then I did that on every question. If a question said, do you ever have problems with your employer due to your drinking? No. You ever have family problem? No. It had one question, I didn't know what it meant, but it said, have you ever had an eye open And I was like, what the heck is an eye opener? I was like, but that sounds bad. So I said no. And anyway, so I answered all those questions, put the test back in the counselor's so he could look it over. And I remember he looked it over, he went right down like that, and he's like, huh. Then he looks at me and he says, well, you want to look at this test, it tells me you don't have a problem with alcohol. And I'm like, yes. But I wouldn't let him see that. But that's how I was doing cartwheels on the inside. And then he said, however, when I look at your driving record and your criminal record, that says otherwise. So not only am I going to recommend you go to the first 10 classes, but we have a more intensive program as well. And I'm going to recommend you go to those 10 classes as well. I was like, man. But I'm grateful to this day that dude seen right through me. And because he put me on a track to AA. And when I got into those 10 additional classes, I remember showing up at the class and him coming up to me and he says, you still drinking? And I'm like, no. And he's like, no, I know you're not drinking now. He said, I'm talking about between these classes. And I was like, well, yeah. And he was like, what? He said, I was like, well, I thought I could drink as long as I was sober when I come and seen you. And he's like, no, you can't be drinking between these classes. You're in treatment. I was like, oh. And he said, if you don't stop drinking, I can activate your probation. I was like, that don't sound good. So I went to the class that day. And then afterwards, he came up to me and he said, so what's it going to be? And I honestly didn't know if I could stop drinking or not, but I told him I would try. And the next day was August 1st. And I remember getting up on that Friday and making the conscious decision not to drink. And I hadn't had a drink since that day. And I remember going into the Moore County jail. I was doing weekends at the time. So I went into the Moore County jail, and I always before I had detoxed over the weekend. I'd go in there on that Friday and detox through the weekend. And I remember there was a window. There was a window that was kind of made out of plexiglass and it had bars in it. And somebody had taken and burnt a hole in the plexiglass. So you had kind of like a peephole. And I could sit there and look out that peephole, and there was a beer store across the street. Store's still there, but they changed it. Now it's a bail bondsman. But it used to be a beer store. And I would sit there and look through that hole, and my mouth would water. And then when they'd let me out that Sunday afternoon, I'd head straight for that NBS, nearest beer store, and I would buy me a 22 of Heineken, and I would drink that on the way home, and then I would hit the real booze when I got home. And I did that every weekend. But not this weekend. I went in sober, and I wanted to stay sober. I remember being in the block, and typically I'd go in there and just shuck and jive with all the guys in there. And this time I didn't do that. I found another guy that was in that same block, and he had a big book. He had a big book, and maybe I had one too. I can't remember for sure. But I remember us reading the big book together. He was in there for a DWI too, but he's doing all his days in a row. I remember us sitting there talking about wanting to stay sober. We was tired of this way of life. And so I sat there and just went through the big book with him those 3 days or 2.5 days. And it just kept, talking to him. And I remember getting out that Sunday evening. And I remember my wife came, or my girlfriend, future wife, and future ex-wife. Anyway, she came and to pick me up. And I knew it was odd. She was riding in the back seat, and my mother was driving. that was unusual. So I knew something was wrong. And so she picked me up and she greeted me and let me know what happened. We lived in an apartment above a bar in downtown Southern Pines. And over the weekend, somebody had kidnapped her and assaulted her, and in the worst kind of way. And so her emotions were all tore up, and mine too at the time. And I've been detoxed then about not quite 3 days. And I remember going back to the apartment, and I don't remember if I went to a meeting or what. I can't really recall, but I know I picked up a white chip and don't remember picking it up because I still got it at home. I picked it up somewhere. I don't know if it was Sunday or Monday, but I remember being in the apartment Sunday night, and I don't know. I was just in the bedroom, and just all the strength went out of me. I just couldn't stand up anymore. I had this bottom, this emotional, physical, mental bottom that just came over me, and I just couldn't. I fell to my knees, not because I wanted to get on my knees. I just couldn't stand up anymore, and I just had a mental, physical, and emotional, spiritual bottom right there. Surrender. I remember being on my knees and it being so dark. And I think about where Bill talks about in his story. He talks about how he talks about impending calamity, and he talks about quicksand stretching out in all directions. And that's kind of what it felt like. Was I was in a place where it was pretty much death in all directions. If I looked behind me, it was a disaster. And if I looked in front of me, it felt like it was going to be a disaster. I had no hope. There was no hope for the future, and all the regret in the past. And the present was so bad, I couldn't take it either. And so I think about a bottom, something like heard it described, where the fear of the known is greater than the fear of the unknown. And that's kind of where I was at, that fear of where I was at was greater than the fear of the future. And just had a surrender there. And I prayed a simple prayer. I think it's the same prayer that David prayed. God help me. And it's about as simple as you can get. And I've only heard a prayer simpler to that was help me. But God help me was my prayer. And I remember being on my knees for some time. I don't know how long, and it just be in utter darkness, blackness, no hope. And after a while, I don't know, just a glimmer of hope, almost like a candlelight in a dark cave. It's just a glimmer of hope. I don't know where it came from or what. I didn't have any kind of experience or anything other than I just felt like there might be a little bit of hope, and that I should get to these AA people. They might be able to help me. And my counselor already sent me to AA. I actually had a meeting list. I remember I had this meeting list, and he assigned the meetings he wanted me to go to. And one of them was the primary purpose group on Monday, and that was the next day. And so I remember I walked into that meeting, and was in the basement of the church then. I walked in there, it was a circle of chairs. It was a small group, much bigger now. It was a circle of chairs. I walked in, and there was an old guy sitting in there. And he had his arms. He was sitting up on the chair like this, he had his arms spread out. I walked in, and I didn't know what to do. I mean, it felt like that kid in kindergarten again. I was full of fear, didn't know if these people could help me. I didn't know what in the world. And so I walked in there, and he motioned for me. He said, come here. So I walked over there where he was at, and he patted the chair next to him. He just patted the chair. And he said, here, have a seat. I've been saving this chair for you for years. And I went over there and I sat down. I just kind of fell in the chair. I don't know if he could have said anything that would have made me feel more comfortable and at home than that. And I don't know what else he said to me that night. But I know it wasn't long before we were cleaning the coffee pot together, setting up chairs. And he used to say, if you want to help somebody get sober, it's it works better to put a broom in their hand instead of a big book. And so that's what he done with me, is he put me to work. And I was setting up chairs. I was cleaning the coffee, wouldn't let me make coffee yet. I think they gave me the key to the church before they would let me make coffee. And but I would clean the coffee pot, I would set up chairs, and they helped me feel a part of. And that guy's name was Tom I. He passed away here a few months ago, but he was instrumental in my recovery. I've known him since '97, and I was a member of his home group, and he had started that group. And so I was raised up in that group in AA. I was 23 years old, and I'm grateful to that man and the other members that were there. We had some real strong membership, still do. But a lot of the old timers from that time that passed on. Wallace is still around. He's a strong member. Have a lot of respect for Wallace. Does a lot of service. But Tom, we we used to ride together a lot, and I remember going to he was a funny guy. I don't know if any of you know him here, but he was funny to ride with. He was a crazy driver. But I remember I was going out of town. I remember what it was. I was going down to Biloxi, Mississippi. Now, why a newcomer like me needs to go to Biloxi, Mississippi, I don't have any idea. I think I need to go through Biloxi, Mississippi to get to New Orleans. And because I wanted to see the aquarium. Unfortunately, a hurricane took that aquarium out. It was one of the largest aquariums in the world at that time. And so I was heading down there, and I remember going into Biloxi and seeing a sign. And on the sign, I had 90 days of sobriety. And on the sign, it said, shuttle service to and from the riverboats. I saw that sign. I was like, I don't even have to drive. The shuttle service to take me back and forth. And I was thinking, I don't even have to worry about a DWI down here. And all of a sudden, the thought hit my head. It's like, what are you thinking? And I remember I had a phone number in my pocket. And this was before the days of everybody had cell phones. I certainly didn't have one. And Tom had given me a contact name. And I remember going to a payphone somewhere, or it was at the hotel, I don't remember. But I called this number and some guy answered. And he says, yeah, be out at such and such address, and I'll come and get you. I'm like, okay. So I get out there. He didn't even ask me how I had his number. So I get out there and I'm waiting for him. And I'm like, what is this place? And I'm looking around, and it's like, this is like a soup kitchen or something. And so I'm sitting there looking, and I walk up to somebody and I'm like, is there an AA meeting here? They're like, no. Somebody else came up to me and they said, well, there used to be an AA meeting here a couple of years ago, but there's not one here anymore. I was like, oh, okay. I said, well, somebody told me they was going to meet me here. He said, oh, he'll be along directly. You come to find out, that guy had been coming there for the last 2 years, every single time, to see if somebody showed up for the AA meeting or not. And then he would take them to where the meeting was at. Well, the guy shows up, picks me up. He's like, oh, by the way, how'd you get my phone number? And I said, a guy named Tom gave it to me. He said, Tom who? I said, Tom I. He said, Tom I. I'm like, yeah. He said, you know him? I like, yeah. He said, Tom I from Aberdeen. I said, yeah, I know him. He's in my home group. And but it let me know how small the world of AA is. And here I am all the way down in Biloxi, Mississippi, and some guy knows a guy in my home group. And that's kind of how it's been. Is I've met people all over this nation. I don't have time to tell many more stories, but what I can say is I'm not the same guy that came into AA back in '97. I'm a changed guy due to these steps, sponsorship, a higher power, service work, the things that I've done. And I'm a believer that you always have to go forward or else you're going to go backwards. I don't believe you can sit in one spot, stagnate. And I also believe that if I don't change, I'll drink again, because the same man or woman will drink again. And, and so I have to change. And the program has changed me. And I'm grateful for all of you for listening to me, and I'm grateful for my cough held off too. But that's all I got, Stephen. Thank you.